think AI has some interesting concepts, but I see AI as kind of a two-edged sword right now, anyway, in the state it's currently in. It can do some fun, cool things, and maybe there's some fun, cool things that kids could do with that. Um, like I've got a daughter who wants to be a novelist, and she's having fun just kind of exploring. Hey, write me a paragraph about this and this and this, and getting ideas from that and that kind of thing. That's pretty cool. Um, but there are serious flaws with trying to get programming and development done by AI because it doesn't think about things like security flaws and all the potential gotchas and how is a human going to use this, how are what kind of things might a human do to break this, where do I need safety nets. And I see that as, if you get a child into it that way, they won't develop the capacity to think about those things because they'll think about it like the AI does. And they'll learn to think that way.
I'd draw that line in a slightly different place because do you remember the old XKCD comic where somebody is talking about how they send text messages all the time and talking about how terrible it is that kids use text message abbreviations and
Yeah.
they'll never learn to write that way. And the guy says, seriously? I want you to imagine that there was a generation that grew up with a ball in one hand all the time, and they would spend all their time bouncing the ball up and down, throwing the ball to each other, messing around. Do you really think, regardless of how bad their form was compared to people playing serious baseball, that generation would grow up worse at baseball than a generation that didn't do that? Really? And I think there's not only something to that, like that's seeing the core of it. If you could use it to make programming more accessible, and specifically the kind of thinking you do in programming more accessible, that could be beautiful. And the reason that I think AI is not going to do that, not anytime this decade, maybe next decade, we'll see how it goes. The reason we're not going to see AI do that is because all the incentives point the wrong direction. So like I am extremely enthused about AI for GitHub Copilot, the current one, not the chat one, and extremely against ChatGPT. And it is not about the quality of the large language model underneath. It is not even vaguely about it. The thing is that you can have the AI in a hands-off way just write a whole bunch of stuff and then click accept, which is terrible, and I'm against it. It's how that's how ChatGPT is generally used. They're having something that can't think and can't take responsibility think for you, which is horrible.
Mm-hmm.
Or you've got GitHub Copilot. One of the massive underrated features of GitHub Copilot, from my point of view, something that makes it far and away the best LLM I've seen, is that it's constantly wrong. It's used as an autocomplete, and it's almost always wrong. And when it miraculously produces a whole paragraph of code at a time, not a page, just a paragraph, you go, oh, fantastic. And you ignore the fact that it was wrong the previous 6 times and just completely way off base, and you just kept typing. And the advantage of that is that you're very much still engaged in the process. It is not an Uber self-driving car where you stop paying attention to it for an hour and then it hits a pedestrian. It is doing something, but it never takes control away from you because it's almost always wrong. And you treat it like it's almost always wrong. And that's fantastic. And since the incentives are all wrong, they're pushing GitHub constantly to stop doing that and make it more like ChatGPT, which they are.
Yeah. Well, and that's the part I'm worried about. Like with ChatGPT as a exposure to especially younger children who are learning how to think in logic terms, right? Because that's not something I guess that's a developed skill. That's a learned skill, thinking logic. You don't learn, you're not born with if loops and while loops and stuff. You don't think like that. So if you get into habits of, this is the right way to write code because that's how I've learned from ChatGPT, I think that stunts a bit of thinking growth there. While I think it could, well, yeah. I think that's a whole series of conversations we could have with the psychology behind that.
What I mean is simpler than that. Pretend that you were trying to teach people to play the piano, and for the vast majority of the time playing the piano, like it's not really about it's about learning to move your fingers the right way. The vast majority of playing the piano, like you're bad at it because you're bad at moving your fingers. What if you had this little like robotic assist that would allow you to program in patterns of of how to move your fingers, and you could just hit a button and it would play a couple of measures for you, and you could hit another button. The reason that would be bad is because you would never learn how to move your fingers properly. It takes all the early stages out of the process completely, and so you never learn them.
Yeah.
The problem with learning to program by ChatGPT is that you will take all the early stuff where you're making your own mistakes out of the process completely, and that makes the learning curve vicious for step one.
Right. And I think, well, and Poto brings up a good point here. Dragon Ruby, I think one of the things that's good about Dragon Ruby is it's very consciously not putting up a this is the way you do things. It's very much a this is a structure, figure out how to do it. It makes you think. It makes you stretch your thinking muscles. And that kind of thing is what I've tried to do with my kids in different areas, not just programming, but that's one area where I think programming is really, really good. I think music has the same benefits because music, because it's a mathematical function, is very good at getting children, younger minds to think in abstract and logical ways at the same time. And programming is very good at that too. I think it's one of the better tools for that kind of thinking training. So, and I think DR does that very well in that here's a framework, figure out what you can do with it.
Yeah. And so I'm all in favor of, simpler frameworks, but I'm also all in favor of making mistakes. Yes, ChatGPT is going to produce some dubious quality code, and for a variety of reasons, that's not what I'm as worried about. I am worried about people using it without paying attention to it. The whole, from the 50s, the IBM things where they point out that a machine can never take responsibility for making a decision, and so you must never treat the machine as though it is taking responsibility for making the decision. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, no, Dragon Ruby is a standard programming environment. It's a good one. I'm all for taking some complexity out of the programming environment.
Mhm.
Learning a basic thing before you learn a more advanced thing is a really good idea, and having anything with some immediate, gratification, some immediate feedback is fantastic. We have far, far too little of that. Scratch actually is fantastic. Scratch is unbelievably good because it's a full strength small talk programming thing combined with immediate gratification. But if you look at the failure mode for Scratch, if you look where that tends to fall down, it's extremely educational. The kids tend to use it for making little music videos, and they love drawing with it, and they love doing the flipping costumes, and they do really simple animations and very little else, which also just happens to be exactly where the tools are really good, and they stop using it where it starts being programmer quality tools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we're kind of talking down two sides of the same track here, in that my concern with ChatGPT is more at the younger end of starting to introduce people to younger minds to programming. If you're not careful, if you don't have some influence that says, okay, it's good to get examples from here, it's good to look at this, but you need to think about these other things as you're looking at this. If you just turn them loose with AI, I think they're going to have problems developing that level of critical thinking because they're not going to know that this is not quite correct. They're going to think this is how it's done. And they're going to miss some of that other thing.
So when I look at this artificial intelligence thing, like when you're thinking about self-driving cars, it reminds me of you've given the keys of the car to a 14-year-old. So they know enough to kind of keep it in the lane to kind of go down, but suddenly they do weird stuff. Like, whoa, what are you doing? An experienced driver saying there, whoa, what are you doing? Don't do that,
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the car suddenly tries to go in the other lane and they gets confused. It's exactly like an underage driver would be.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly with programming, ironically, they try to teach it all this stuff through experience, but yet it is a childlike mind or an inexperienced mind, actually, the discernment, it just isn't there. So it gives you I think this may be it. I don't know, so it throws it out there. And that's exactly what I think when you were talking, Noah, about GitHub Copilot. You're like, it's like this, hard to put an age, but say a 12-year-old gives you suggestions on programming as you're programming. That's why it's all noise. But then suddenly this, it's like, whoa, that was a good suggestion. You know, it does happen. But then Kobayashi
Well,
says, oh,
it happens even with literal 12-year-olds.
what exactly? Well, that's what I'm saying.
That's a true
how I
statement.
that's how I envision these AI. They're just all this AI stuff. It's as if they're too young.
Yeah.
But over
Well,
time,
so here I'll explain where a certain bias on my part comes from, and you can decide how to treat it. So do you notice that AI is being hyped by most of the same people that hyped cryptocurrency? Not just in the same ways, it's the same people doing it. Like we had a hype wave, and suddenly the hype wave, you know, when the price dropped through the floor, all these people were unemployed, and they just kind of moved directly over into hyping AI. Like literally the same people. And so I'll admit some of this is fatigue from arguing with them. But in the same way that the cryptocurrency people were like, oh, we're going to fix all these problems, we're going to fix all these problems, and so you try to spend your time arguing on the problems that are literally unfixable, rather than the problems where, in theory, they might be able to fix them, because they were, you know, some of the, so you could just concentrate on the ones that are theoretically unfixable. In the same way, the AI people, which again is mostly the same people, are saying, "Oh, the next generation will be better. Oh, the next generation will be better." So when you say it's like a 12-year-old, what if you could, you know, what if you could make it like somebody who was a somewhat better programmer, or a somewhat better driver? And so the trick is to look at it and find those particular problems that would not be improved by that. The problem where the machine cannot take responsibility for the decision, it's not really about the quality of the driving. Like, if I, as a driver, am outpaced at some point by a machine driver, pretend you could get a machine driver that was statistically, you know, better as a driver than I am in some
sure.
way. Totally imaginable. I still don't necessarily want to be put on trial for murder for the machine running over somebody.
Yeah.
Like if it's driving and I'm not, I don't really want to be put on trial for the machine committing murder. And that's where you get into a problem where it's not really about the quality of the machine's driving. I mean, in some sense, I'm better off, right? Because I'm less likely to be tried for murder than if I was driving. But in another sense, that's deeply, deeply unfair. And the problem there, the thing that makes that an impossible problem instead of just a bad problem, is that we hit that point where the machine cannot be held responsible for making a decision.
If you like this clip and want to watch another one, you can click right here. Or if you want to watch the full video, you can click here.